Right. So this is the panel, Small Screens and Big Streams, the siren call of technology. And our original article was about this film, Undine. And for today, we've adjusted it to your conference themes on teaching. So I'm going to share my screen and show you the trailer, and then we'll get to reading it.
Er will hier bleiben.
Das ganze Wochenende. Christoph wartet auf Undine. Undine?
Ist mir runtergefallen. Das Bein ist abgebrochen, aber ich habe es wieder geklebt. Du hast gesagt, dass du mich liebst. Für immer. Das hat mich glücklich gemacht. So glücklich, wie ich noch nie glücklich war. Du kannst nicht gehen.
All right, so we'll get to it now. Christian Petzold's film Undine shows the dangers of small screen engagement without limits or empathy, a condition already in place with the globalization of social media that multiplied during the pandemic. By small screens, we mean the move from shared collective experiences of cinema to isolated screens. Our solitary endemic society where users log on to the privacy of their home to small screen, connecting them to an ocean of people, all the while separates them from a larger cultural engagement. This shift promotes invulnerability, the antithesis of the lack necessary for a social link, rendering our society more automated and robotic than ever. Teaching uncertainty and lack in the humanities can activate students as a therapeutic force against the certainty of screen culture.
Undine premiered at the 60th Berlin International Film Festival in February 2020, just prior to as the pandemic was, flourishing. And it was released then again for home cinema in 2021. This, Petzold, I don't know if you know Petzold's film, he's a great filmmaker. It's the first in a trilogy that is transposing myth to modern film to show how myth echoes and reflects in contemporary life today. In the film, the main character, Undine, is a water spirit, the mermaid, a siren, the muse, first dreamed up that figure by the 16th century alchemist Paracelsus, then later developed into a famous character by Frédéric de la Montfouquet, then, as you know, by Hans Christian Andersen and Disney, and also recently rewritten by Toni Morrison, Tar Baby, and Ingeborg Bachmann.
As a water spirit, Undine marks the oceanic unity that must be sacrificed for engaged learning and symbolic life. Machine culture promises a sense of wholeness in the siren call that denies lack and otherness. Teaching the humanities means engaging this lack and otherness as an opportunity for reflective learning and real connection. Undine shows how surfing the small screen involves an engagement with the siren who tempts through the promises of wholeness without separation. Undine is the siren's voice that calls out from screens where online users endlessly browse. She is emblematic of an oceanic feeling without separation or limit, like what Freud describes as a sensation of eternity, a feeling of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, oceanic. In Orwell's 1984, we also see the oceanic as dependency upon a superstate that is the vehicle for an unending series of victories over our own memories. Reality control, they call it in Newspeak, doublethink. What we are calling the oceanic refers to our small screen world of control through rhetoric, surveillance, and social media apps that incite addiction to the viral. This world worships certainty and invulnerability, unlike the humanities where we can learn how to live with uncertainty and otherness. Undine shows how film and literature can help our students be more critical and find self-directed ways through uncertain times.
In showing the relationship between the oceanic and extremist politics, Undine is not new. Orwell, after all, named his state Oceania, the superstate that controls the Western world through newspeak, surveillance, and oppression. Correlatively, virtual reality provides oceanic screens that promise a kind of imaginary unity. They're actually often used for marketing, that gentler sway of surveillance and control. Big and small screen corporate ideologies both share the view that technology should unite and connect, eschewing difference and lack. A small screen allows us the illusion that the personal is not political, denying its partisanship. In small screen culture, the other exists even less than with big screens where we're sitting at least side by side watching and can discuss. Citizens exist in their little technological media social bubble with themselves and the screen. Small screens give the illusion of intimacy, yet there can be sometimes no dialogue or negotiation. Even before this world that we're living in now was invented, these devices, if you read Orwell carefully, were part of Oceania.
In 1984, a narcissistic body politic exerts limitless control over its subjects and traps them in the imaginary. Or as the philosopher Jacques Lacan explains, it puts citizens in a state of being in captivation by images. Our world is becoming more like Oceania, a virtual reality world of imaginary tribes and projected states. Technological control through narcissism is seen in the very names of our everyday mobile devices: iPhone, iPad, iMac. Every device contains the word I as a trick so that, and this is a quote from Jaron Lanier, the computer scientist, narcissism can be indulged without the terror of being out of touch or out of control. This formula is a magnet for human longing. It's all about my I this or my I that, unquote. The I is simultaneously a lure for the subject and the mechanism that controls them via the oceanic. Undine, like limitless technology, hooks users in with fluidity of mobile devices that appeal to their narcissism and promise to fulfill our every desire. In putting limits on technology, we put limits on our narcissism. We begin to learn through lack and attention to otherness in a praxis or a potential of a special kind, which constitutively maintains itself in a relationship with its own inoperativity. Learning requires knowing when it is time to be still and step away from a screen, or time to be critically engaged.
Okay, before I just want to that was a quote from Agamben that Jessica just said, that a learning that maintains itself in relation to its own inoperativity, not like a perfect operativity, right? The oceanic small screen is now an inevitable part of our everyday relation to technology and to the world. The film shows surfing with sirens is far from an ancient myth, but alive and well at the bottom of our small screen seas. Undine uses water and glass to show how a lack of separation and a desire for imaginary wholeness is a certain dream of technology today. Virtual reality controls most of our everyday narrative. Jacques Lacan presciently claimed that the signifier has become the apparatus of jouissance. We won't give you too much Lacanian mishigas, okay? But wait, the signifier has become part of the apparatus of jouissance through capitalist discourse. He says capitalist discourse is something that consumes itself and that consumes itself so that it is consumed. Little could he imagine how, when he said that in the 70s, how true that is today. The wish for narrative wholeness has shifted from face-to-face encounters in community to safe spaces of small screens. As the call of the small screen, Undine is a figuration of what eludes the user's sight. She embodies the mythic promise of complete unity as a projection of what refuses the mirror alienation and lack.
Today, with our Apple Watch, Fitbit, and iPhone, the siren call is always present. If, as Slavoj Žižek has put it, cinema teaches us how to desire, the small screen presents new challenges to such a teaching. By small screens, we mean the move away from shared collective cinematic or screened experiences to the isolation of personalized, data-rich, and data-gathering activities. Instead of being autonomous navigators, online users are targets tricked by Oceania, parasitic corporate and social networks. Small screens incite narcissistic jouissance and unbound surfing that makes the internet an ocean all too real. Undine emerges from the water, that is the screen, as a partner of jouissance, meaning enjoyment. She deepens a condition already in place by way of modern technology that escalated during the pandemic.
As the embodiment of a material real, Undine's amours exemplify the relation of users to small screens. The film reminds us that the oceanic dimension, while necessary, is at the same time lethal for humans. While the internet promises a kind of pre-symbolic maternal connection without subjection to elements, the film underlines the dangers of non-separation in this oceanic sea. Today, streaming services are the new umbilical cord, promising a subjectivity beyond death. People die, but their Facebook profile lives on. This is exactly the kind of watery simulacra that requires separation to engage in reality. The internet, like the ocean, is a stream that can be a resource depending on how it's used. It is, like oxygen or the other elements, water, fire, air, earth, a resource that tends towards excess, deluge, and saturation, or dearth, scarcity, and emptiness. It reminds us of the real as a force of jouissance manifest in the material world that is not good or bad, but depends on how it is siphoned or shepherded.
In Undine, Christoph, he was the diver you saw. Christoph's relation to the infinite oceanic element of nature is his work, not a sport or a hobby. As such, we might point out that his know-how with the oceanic is not reducible to enjoyment. Christoph's facility diving underwater contrasts with the now popular sport of freediving. Freediving involves plunging underwater and descending as deep as possible without scuba gear for as long as an athlete can hold their breath. The lure of surpassing bodily limits of breathing, submerging further and further below, makes the sport competitive, with winners often blacking out, draining oxygen reserves, taunting death, and even dying. The fact that doctors must be present in these competitions only points to the limitless enjoyment and death-driven lure of the sport.
The sport of this freediving and holding your breath parallels our small screen world, where people take deep dives into the metaverse, gaming, tweeting, and Instagram to drown in virtual reality without taking a breath. Subsequently, in popular culture, people feel that they are drowning their stress. They need to exhale. We see this frequently nowadays in faddish, coveted breathing apps like Headspace, breathing, Wim Hof, yoga, or any new practice that perpetuates programmed servitude of the neoliberal body in late capital. These apps illustrate how the film relates to our time by revealing the inundation of the oceanic drives in our everyday life. Unlike enthusiasts of these apps or sports, Christoph, our diver in the movie, does not free dive. He is an engineer, and he brings his supplemental equipment, including his snorkel, to breathe underwater.
We could ask, if breath cuts water and water cuts breath, what cuts internet streaming? Drowning or having the air cut off is analogous to losing oneself while submerged in virtual reality without limits. The word or breath as separation is a bodily limit, cutting the oceanic. Intentional breathing delineates the oceanic primordial waters out of which we are born. This is exemplified in the Odyssey through Odysseus's encounter with the Sirens. Odysseus intentionally binds himself and stuffs his ears with wax to sail past and through the oceanic. As the myth shows, strategic submission through lack and vulnerability is a powerful force against the overwhelming tides of screen culture.
Modern users of technology, like Homer's sailors in the Odyssey, risk succumbing to the imaginary capture while surfing. Odysseus is an example of parsing the oceanic, of not succumbing to the siren call. It's what makes him heroic, right? The Odyssey features those myriad siren figures, including Circe, Calypso, the sirens themselves. After Odysseus escapes the island of Circe, he must then overcome the sirens, a double departure from this imaginary capture. Forewarned this time, he, as we know, plugs his ears and binds himself to the mast, making the men promise not to untie him, which sometimes is overlooked, the idea of the promise functioning there as well, and the importance of the word. What is the equivalent of this kind of restraint, a symbolic and a real one, when today?
I teach the Odyssey books 9 through 13 in a totally asynchronous class and do group work. So if we want to talk about it after, I mean, this is interesting. Technological devices and platforms, including iPhones, Facebook, and social media, all host a siren call that makes unfettered users feel immortal, powerful, and connected. Ancient mythic sirens tempted the sailors much like modern siren servers. These are the machines that vacuum up personal data to harvest information. Jaron Lanier, the computer scientist who founded the word virtual reality, explains how companies like Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, and Google began using siren servers to capture and hold data in, quote, gigantic facilities located in obscure places where they have their own power plants and some special hookup to nature, like a remote river that allows them to cool a fantastic amount of waste heat, unquote. These siren servers make users feel in control even while being tracked. Perhaps more powerful than Homer's siren song, today's modern siren servers call is silent. So we do not even know or hear a voice and know how to circumvent being seduced. In The Silence of the Sirens, Franz Kafka wrote about that siren silence, and from which there is no resistance.
Tech companies' siren servers work like the sirens in Homer's Odyssey, through a stealth blackmail where you don't really see or hear what's in front of you on the internet. They work outside of the visible. In Lanier's virtual reality, when someone signs up for any social network, their data, their information is captured by siren servers. All of this is done with the illusion that everything is free for the user. So the deal looks sweet, but you don't see what's in front of you, says Lanier. While putting information into one of these servers, one becomes captured data. As one of the experts in cyberpunks explains, quote, most of the time we're not even aware of how close to the violence we are, because we all grant concessions to avoid it. Like sailors smelling the breeze, we rarely contemplate how our surface world is propped up from below by darkness. These servers that prop up our virtual reality steer through an invisible gaze that conceals who or what institutions are at the helm.
The film Undine is all about shepherding the oceanic, not cutting it off, but finding a way to siphon the oceanic, which is not rational or predictable. This involves preserving otherness and setting limits on the allure of complete connectivity. Kristoff, Undine's lover, like Odysseus, goes into the eye of the siren storm, hears the sing chatter, only to live, become a father, and pass on his name at the end of the film. Like the band Odysseus, who lets his crew know when the ship has passed the realm of the sirens, Kristoff intentionally and sacrificially, like a Christ figure, goes underwater to fall in love with the beautiful Jiltrid siren. When they quarrel, Kristoff has a diving accident and blacks out after being deprived of oxygen for 12 minutes. He becomes a follower of Undine, making a symbolic sacrifice true to his name, Kristoff. In response to his devotion, Undine engages in her own real sacrifice for Kristoff. It is real precisely because, as a mythic creature, Undine does not exist in the symbolic realm and is unable to lack, but out of love, she dies a human death. The reference to Christian monotheism, both embracing and trumping the pagan gods, couldn't be more evident.
Frantic that he misunderstood her, Undine leaves a message on Kristoff's voicemail saying that she wasn't waiting for her old boyfriend, she was actually waiting for him. We discover that Kristoff phoned Undine. In the movie, it's kind of, he's in a coma because he lost oxygen, and we find that he phoned her in the coma. So it's not clear what that means, right? As if by magic, he was able to speak to her in this kind of place between life and death. And later in the film, she's informed that he was already brain dead when he made the phone call, so it would have been impossible. This underscores this kind of passionate reel of connection between them. Of course, as Jessica just said, Undine then sacrifices herself, and like kind of like Little Mermaid, or where you see where Hans Christian Andersen got this from. She returns to the water, kind of to give herself to the water to save him. So it's like it's a kind of pure exchange, like, so, which is not the same thing as something symbolic. It's like she well, it's absolute. She dies, so he, or she doesn't die, she kind of lives forever, which is another kind of death. um uh okay, Jess, you want next paragraph?
Okay, Undine shows how the ocean, like the internet, is a stream whose value as a resource depends on the way it is handled. Our use of technology, like oxygen or the other elements, determines its values. Today's practices of technology tend toward the excessive, being online all the time, or scarcity. Oh, and being on the wrong side of the digital divide, where online access is difficult. The oceanic controls through both deprivation and deluge, not transparent political and cultural apportioning. Users spend a lot of time online, contract a limitless feeling of connection without community, which leads them then to cancel culture. After all, a negativity must be created somewhere.
Jess, should we skip the Toni Morrison? Because it's
I don't know, when does our panel end? We might have time.
I don't know.
Because there's only 3 paragraphs after that.
Okay, then we'll read it. Okay. So, for example, Toni Morrison who has now been banned in some parts of America for writing about how people prefer fabricating myths of the noble past to the realities of present-day racism. Morrison modernizes and rewrites the Undine myth in her novel Tar Baby. The novel portrays the love affair of Jadine and Son, 2 Black Americans abandoned by their mothers who grow up in very different class structures. Jadine is adopted by a wealthy family who owns a home in the Caribbean, where the story is set. Son is from an impoverished South, yet uses his trickster cleverness and good looks to travel all over the world, including to the Caribbean island where Undine resides. The struggles of Jadine and Son exemplify the illusions or self-deceptions regarding race, class, and gender that support their worlds, until they do not.
Going further than Christoph, who lives after the death of loving Undine, Morrison's Tar Baby exposes the hypocrisy of those powers that claim to offer imaginary freedom while entrapping users in the oceanic. Jadine's adopted father, Valerian Street, is like a mythic fox, an owner of the field, or Siren servers, right, who builds a tar baby to entrap. This happens when Valerian hosts an interloper who has no name except Son as a guest in their home after he breaks in and watches the women for several days from a closet. After becoming an invited guest, Son and Undine fall in love and swap roles as figures. This is like Undine and Christoph. Figures of the classic Tar Baby myth, both playing the lure who entrap or the rabbit who sticks. They recognize the decoy of the fox's trap. The host and the homeowner sets up their meeting, but they pretend not to know after getting caught up in the seduction. Just like we pretend we don't know they're Siren servers or that Facebook is behind everything. Valerian's generosity affects a lack of boundaries that ultimately disenfranchises everyone in his orbit and upends the whole island manor.
Morrison's novel reworks the Undine and Tar Baby myths to show how fluidity in identification and stereotyping is part of the self-deception and stickiness of symbolic, quote, authenticity. It shows how Valerian's generosity is a product of his egoism, vanity, and attempts to control their world. Separately, the maid named Undine becomes the hero who avoids the stickiness of illusory conceits to reveal the rotten truth about the patron Street family. Undine, in the novel, discloses how Valerian's wife cut their biological son from birth with a razor that drew blood on his legs until he was old enough to resist. She exposes the bizarre torture at a Thanksgiving meal where, since the Street's actual son didn't attend, they invited their adopted child, Jadine, the interloper Son, and servants like Undine and her husband. In a double exposure of the plantation proprietor as a, quote, good father, patron, plantation owner, Undine serves up a candid reality that cuts through the street's illusory, quote unquote, ethics and their elevated rhetoric and their unchallenged reputation. In this way, Morrison's novel demystifies the oceanic illusion of the street family, island plantation, and its surrounding waters as unified in this beautiful wholeness.
Undine deposes the planter, unlike the mythic rabbit and the tar baby decoy. Morrison's brilliant novel shatters the whole mythic screen of the street family. Valerian Street, the plantation owner in Fox, made his money from a sugar store in Philadelphia, catching customers with the ultimate culinary lure. Ironically, his cook, Undine, remains unsusceptible to Valerian's sugar. In the preface to Morrison's novel, Undine is described as one of those, quote, African-American women who are not sidetracked by seduction and cynical about authenticity. They are the ones able to witness as a challenge, as judges, intent on the uses to which stories are engaged and the manner of their telling, unquote. Tar Baby complicates the Undine myth by underlying the importance not only of how to parse the elemental for all its layers and resources, but how to witness the hidden true stories that surface out of the oceanic, glistening but smothering waters.
Correlatively, both Undine, the film, and Morrison's Tar Baby show how negotiating elemental enjoyment, what Lacan calls jouissance, is less a rational activity than a bodily practice of cultivating and allocating creation as a resource. Habits of separation and limitation are necessary to parse out and share the elemental streams of this economy and of this oceanic technology. The unfair allocation of resources and ongoing historic racial inequity that finally surfaced in the pandemic with cultural disasters like the death of George Floyd and the incited protests, I can't breathe, still resounds. Voices witnessed and finally called the one-sided chokehold of law enforcement upon Floyd, which was a visual reminder of drowning without limits in both an inequitable justice system and a divided community. It's no wonder people took to the streets during the pandemic. Multitudes of protesters are the flip side of the small screen usage, that is, quarantine, isolation, and mass protests mobilize as a group, drowning individuals in a crowd. Undine and Tar Baby are a reminder to remember the dangers of forgetting a shameful history. They challenge us to recover vulnerability, lack, to breathe, and to step away from the decoys until we can see better our society and ourselves.
The film, like Morrison's novel, exposes the siren call that hides a more lethal fox. In the case of the novel, Valerian Street, and in the case of technology, military, and software companies that use siren servers to control users. Oceanic culture thrives where there's no lack or restraints that would create technological limits. Liking content is the way we assent to the new cultural misappropriation. Moreover, following Freud's observations, we can consider technology as a set of artificial organs or extensions of our natural body. Freud early on noted that, quote, the relationship between us and our tools is often blurred and frequently intimate, unquote. Mobile devices like cell phones, tablets, smartwatches are what Lacan calls latouses, in that they disconnect us from reality while making us feel that we are connected. Undine and Tar Baby are a lure akin to this latouche, a lethal object that makes us forget the structure of power to which we are subjected. As a small part of a terrible whole, this is a quote, one mustn't tease the latouches too much. Technological devices like the iPhones and other iThings tap into anxieties about the self as a postmodern construct. In modern day society, the benefits of using this equipment accrues to the owner of servers and not to the citizens. Government and corporate proprietors prey on our desire for wholeness that is offered with the oceanic, and also created by tech company founders like Apple's Steve Jobs.
I do want to say one thing about Lacan, this kind of French, like crazy there's a billion of them, but this one that this neologism he coins in his when he discusses or he invents this idea of the discourse of the capitalist. He says la tous is a kind of object that he says in the 70s capitalism will force our dependency on, that we will be constantly using an object that is meant to meant to expire or meant to fail, and that we will constantly misrecognize our desire in terms of those objects. So that's like not new, but I mean that he's kind of also he gets the word, or he invents that word that has the word leth in it, like lethal and forgetting and all those ideas. All right, after spending time dropping out of college in India, Steve Jobs saw gurus as the focal point of love and respect. He then modeled himself as Apple CEO upon the guru model, a narcissistic structure where followers are often treated harshly or badly to make them more devoted. Undine, like the guru, is a prophetess and enticer of desire, the ultimate seducer whose allure and whose trap is death. Simulating a watery realm with no borders, the Apple Store interior was designed to look like an ashram. We read about this. The idea was that it would be all white to model the transcendence and take humans to a place beyond their boundaries. Jaron Lanier explains that the Apple architecture, at the same time, this is a quote, the white space must be highly structured and formal. There must be a tangible aura of discipline and adherence to the master plan. So there's like those two ideas, the oceanic, the infinite, the beyond, heaven, Shangri-La, the Apple Store, but also this kind of discipline. Tech stores are temples in our new world, but not in terms of the social and political power structure that drowns users in addiction, as in ancient Homer. The twist is that in Homer's time, memory and narrative keep Odysseus from drowning. But today, memory and narrative are being erased and drowned by this undoing of civilization.
As navigators of the oceanic, programmers have an adage for overthinking a solution that goes, don't boil the ocean. That's because they know that the ocean cannot be contained to boil it. Now, it's not just programmers, but everyday online users whose health depends on bodily separation and making limits. Small screen devices are sold as decoys, tar babies, limitless joy devices that social media companies can use for entrapment through purposes of marketing, tracking, and listening. Solitary small screen culture depends upon people surfing to feel connected in an ocean of people. Yet modern machine culture makes people more isolated without the other, even while being submerged online and imagining themselves as sitting with millions of other users. This shift promotes the illusion of invulnerability and certainty, the antithesis of the lack necessary for the social link, risking a society more automated and robotic than ever. Technology creates users, not agents or subjects.
Like other mythic permutations of Undine is a water spirit that marks a kind of amniotic unity that has to be sacrificed in order to live. Water is symbolic of screens without limits, where people imagine that a certain kind of connection is possible. The duped online subject prefers to be in relation to Undine via their oceanic phone or their computer screen, swimming in an imaginary kind of puddle, that's in the film, rather than in the real with others. The film demystifies and critiques the seductive realm of that connectivity, both in form and content. Undine, like the internet, comes from nowhere and goes nowhere. Ultimately, she exemplifies the undone. She's about the entropy of death as a constant undoing, like and the undoing of subjectivity in history. Mm-hmm.
So, in traditional accounts of the mythic story, a man is caught up, killed, or consumed by Undine. Petzold's film shows something different. Christoph lives and is saved by Undine. Even though he turns away from the Siren, in the end, he remains in a relation of loss to Undine and the death drive she embodies. To hear the Siren's voice is to realize death is the unacknowledged and unsung partner of our desire. You don't get rid of it, you just work with it. Despite that reckoning, Christoph embraces fatherhood. In the end of the film, he embraces fatherhood, his partner, with his partner who has his carrying their child, and his profession. He separates finally from the Siren who exists for eternity by having worked through a relation to death.
Undine is, by the way, it's very moving. The movie's exquisitely beautiful. It's beautiful, and he's an underwater. We took out the whole reading of the film, but he's an underwater engineer, and what is an under? And he's kind of at home in that underwater world. But this is kind of where this kind of falling in love with Undine, this breaking of the glass of the aquarium, it's kind of like this kind of total love catastrophe that then the film works through with Undine dying for him. Undine is a cautionary tale about diving into the totalizing virtuality of the real. On the one hand, the film shows how contemporary subjectivity and history are being submerged by this oceanic infinite enjoyment, as exemplified in their kind of infinite love relation. But on the other hand, Undine shows how civilization depends on separation and a kind of awareness that screens do not provide the imagined hope for perfection, invulnerability, infinity. A recovery of restraint lack in online engagements is fundamental for learning, for culture, for human culture. We have to stop saying water under the bridge and viewing the other as superfluous to remain submerged in our small oceanic screens. This means heeding the real other history, the small other that keeps calling us back, not as infinity, but as an undoing of the, well, let's say, of the Lacan's drive. We're thinking of, instead of Undine, but undining and undoing that. Like, how do we, even as teachers in our classroom, how do we undo the effects of that kind of sleepiness that we see, that a slight depression that happens with Zoom teaching? How are we like interrupting the technology in some way? Thank you. You guys we're small, you can unmute yourselves if you want to. It's going to make a discussion. I wanted to maybe just say one more thing as I'm thinking out loud at the end of this paper. I remember working with a psychoanalyst who works with neonates who are preemies, and she talks about how parents of she's actually probably the most well-known infant psychoanalyst in the world. All right, she's a lot of the parents are, the children, when they're born at like 24 weeks, the babies are quite ugly to look at, and it's very hard to have the parents connect to that fetus. I'm saying this for a reason. She talked about a child, a 3-year-old, who used to wrap himself in wires to go to sleep, right? And these children are in incubators for a long time. And what she found, that the children, premature babies put in incubators, can actually be fine. Okay, they can be fine. But what was very, very important was that the parents and the caretakers and the team in the neonate hall, whatever, that they interrupt the machine. A mother never feeds her child infinitely, right? But that the wires are feeding the baby infinitely, and it's kind of interrupting the function of frustration and tension that's necessary for becoming human. So when people started to work on that, they started to kind of like, because the babies have to have some of that connection. But what the parents had to do was to kind of invent, like, even when the baby's in utero, the mother eats a pizza one day and like the baby freaks out or something, but none of that freaking out is happening in the incubator. It's in a kind of like infinitely joyous environment of being all hooked up, right? So that the goal was to kind of interrupt that way of being hooked up, right? So that's that idea is kind of in our paper and in terms of the film. I know that it's hard without I mean, when we talking at a paper at people with all these kind of crazy French terms, it's like it's outrageous. But I hope you could.
I was thinking as we were
Yeah.
reading it again, a little modified, about like the idea of seduction, because there's kind of a running metaphor, right? Like that actual like romantic seduction is a kind of metaphor analogous, like the Tar Baby myth and Undine show this like mad love affair, and like, you know, the mad love affair as an analogy for our mad love for technology, like we don't even know it, you know. And like sometimes you know, I wonder about seduction in our modern era, because it's like in a way there is no more seduction because it's already over and done with, you know. And the whole idea that it's a process, it's not a given, seems to be gone, both, you know, in teaching and in life, especially like online teaching. There's no attempt to sort of charm, like, you know, each other into wanting, like, curiosity, seduction. In these ways we are vulnerable. And so there's something about machine culture that makes us even in like stop trying to be vulnerable and to use seduction and curiosity in these states of vulnerability in ways that will enrich our life, but and instead do it, use these things in ways that will make us more invulnerable and certain. And so the whole idea of a mad love affair is just, it's just like, it's moot now, it seems like, with technology like this, and seduction as well.
It's interesting. How do you think gender plays into that? So, I mean, all these terms and words, or whether it's Undine or whether it's Steve Jobs, you
Right.
know, feminizing his first computer, you know, what was it, Lisa or something, to the sirens and seduction and amniotic fluid and all those things. Is there, do you play that out, flesh that out a little bit in there too, or not?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think since Plato's Symposium, which it has a hermaphrodite in it, and the whole point of that dialogue is that we all want to be whole, right? So like seduction is this like idea that the other person can make us whole and give us wholeness. Well, we don't think people will do that anymore. We think computers will, right? So everybody's kind of shifted to connecting and like the illusion of wholeness coming through, I mean, through, you know, more so through modern technology in the modern era, you know, than through what it was in past eras, I suppose. Like, you know, there was technology, but in different forms, money, whatever. So I think that the gender statement, you know, this desire for connection and wholeness early on was manifest in the desire for wholeness as being a united, all-inclusive being, right, of all genders, right? Like,
maybe to follow on that, like, you know, in 1929 in Civilization and Discontents, Freud writes about the oceanic feeling. It's the first chapter, okay? And he says, actually, of course, I'm not surprised, but Freud actually said he never had that feeling. No shit, I'm not surprised. That's why, yeah. But Raymond Roland, who's writing to him, who's like a religious, more has studied the East, he feels very strongly about this kind of oceanic feeling. And then Freud's like, well, what the hell is the oceanic feeling? What are you talking about? Like, it's certainly not like a Freudian feeling, right? And you know, in that body of theory, that is more on the side not of gender but of the mother. So it's like some kind of nostalgic wish for unity, which is actually not really gendered. We could gender it, but it's more on the side of death, and that's the one we were. In a way, gender would be a protection from that. Or we could also say some men use women. I mean, feminist theory is about the use of women for that death and how they don't want to die in that imaginary game. But it's not gendered as such in a way. It's like the failure of gender, if we could say. I thought of one other thing in a book I edited with a colleague on violence and psychoanalysis. We had this guy wrote a really interesting paper about his team, and they work with the video addicted kids, like video game addicted teenagers and children who some of them are who are not going to sleep or just like living playing video games, and their parents can do nothing about it. It's you know, and what they do with these kids is they they go, like, it's kind of like working with autism. Like they go and they're on the game with the kid until the kid is relying on that other there, and then they start to like work on the interruption of it, like of like the way to invent distance, right? So I mean, just like it's another idea of like how to get out of the of the infinite promise of the technological in some way.
Could I just ask a Petzold question that may fall slightly beyond the scope of your
Of course.
argument? Just I'm curious. I love him. I think this is the only feature film of his that I haven't seen, just because I haven't sort of had a chance to see it yet. And it sounded at first like it was maybe a departure from his other stuff, the idea of the mythic, the fantasy. But now I'm wondering if it's maybe a flowering of like some mythic underpinnings of some of his other texts. And there's certainly, it's all subjectivity, all about history in his other work. So I was wondering if you just saw like a sort of a connection within the entire sort of body of his work with this film.
Yeah, and I think that like we didn't talk about that because we thought like that we were cutting our paper by a lot. Like, what are we gonna, you know, there Undine, what her job is now that she's like not a mermaid living in our world among us, is that she's a history lecturer. Like, but
Really?
she lectures like robotically on history. She's a tour guide, and about the marsh underneath Berlin, like, right. So it's like she's a and she like that's what she does every day.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't read all the stuff about Berlin and the past and the history being submerged. It is a lot like Phoenix, like where, you know, we use the oceanic, like we use technology and this sense that we're beyond vulnerability to forget the past and just move on. And the film, it contains that tension in relation to the city of Berlin. And we do a lot more in the paper with that, and how there's the tension to, you know, either just to forget the whole thing and, you know, just swim in desire and wholeness and forget about, you know, disaster, or, you know, nostalgically be unable to deal with the past. And that is definitely a feature of this film. So I would say it's a lot like Barbara or Phoenix. But those, I mean, different. I mean, this is definitely a post-war, what is Berlin like now kind of film. And also he's going to do 2 more. It's a trilogy about how ancient myths apply to modern day culture. So I'm so excited because there's going to be 2 more. I hope you are too.
Also, we should also point out she has a first boyfriend at the beginning of the film, and they broke up, and she was like, "Don't you can't leave me." And then later in the end of the film, she'll kill him, like she drowns him, right? So there's like a, you know,
it seems like he's a Stasi, like a former Stasi officer too. So
so we're happy he's drowned.
A lot of things they're forgetting, like they're using love to forget a lot of things. And honestly, people do that now too. Like, oh, like, you know, I'm just gonna go on Tinder and forget about it, or, you know, I mean, yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'd love to read the full thing sometime when it comes out.
I mean, we did go. We have to admit, our paper did go swimming a little bit, right? We were like, wee, like it was a little bit too much, right? But it's a very.
Oh, it was great. It was fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I say it's a very beautiful movie too, like, and it's very touching, and there's like that idea also that there's a learning, like Christoph learns something about, like by having that kind of complete crash of his life, like, and then by dying, like of course he comes back to life, he breathes, right? But it's kind of it's like there's a learning of the limits of the wish, we could say, for that infinite place, right? And that's I think what, you know, is maybe that idea is how do we think about that as teachers, like because especially, I mean, we didn't talk about this that much today, a little bit, but about like the Zoom fatigue now, right? I mean, we had first, it was, I mean, it was very exciting, the beginning of everybody was alive and awake, even the students. And then like there's a kind of like a kind of, I don't know, depression that maybe set in after a long time of this, right? Where it's hard to get awake again, you know.
I just keep going back to the Odyssey. And so like, I think maybe you go into this more in the full paper, there are so many layers to it, right? That it's Circe actually who, with whom Odysseus is actually in love, right? She doesn't trick him. They're on an equal footing. They're both equal. They're on equal sort of terms, and then they love, and then he leaves, right? But with her consent. Unlike, you know, some of the other women that he's with, like Calypso, who traps him. But she's the one who warns him about the sirens and tells him how to escape. And I think that that's really interesting that it's mediated through her, and that she saves him, right, from the sirens. But then there's also this interesting reciprocal relationship with his crew, right, because they're the ones who have their ears full of wax, and he's allowed to hear it, but he's also bound. There's so much there. I think that it's so fascinating. And then I was reading, I was just trying to remember the story, and I was just reading very quickly while you were giving your presentation that there are I didn't know this, or I didn't remember that there are post-Homeric parts of the myth where the sirens, because they've been tricked by Odysseus, commit suicide and drown in the ocean. I thought that was really sort of maybe connected as well.
Yeah, I mean, when I teach the Odyssey, I'm like, let's talk about what the sirens represent, you know? And it's like literally alarms, emergency, but also seductive, alluring, what entices us, but also can, you know, traumatize us. And like, how do we negotiate this realm? We don't learn, like, it's not a knowledge thing, you know?
Well, but they offer him knowledge, right? They offer him knowledge about the war, what really happened. Yeah.
Yeah, but it has more, right, exactly. They're deceptive, like Tar Baby, right? Like, and so there's this kind of like, let's approach it with different bodily, and you as you pointed out, like, with some of the sirens, Odysseus has the ability to negotiate the test, not with knowledge, but with a bodily practice. And that's part of what we have to do with our students, I think, is, you know, talk about what are, you know, the bodily practices or, you know, approaches that will help us to negotiate the irrational, uncertain things that we, you know, are living through these times. And yeah, absolutely. And you know, in the ancient myths, the sirens are gendered as feminine, but like Mani was saying, there's this sense that Odysseus gets more comfortable as he gets more comfortable with negotiating desire and the feminine, and he can leave it, as you said, he leaves Circe. He becomes more adept at negotiating the oceanic, at this realm beyond gender. That, like the internet, you know, as long as we know how to negotiate it more bodily than intellectually, it becomes, it's like the sirens will kill themselves. The seduction of the internet negates itself once we know how to negotiate it. It's like you say, maybe the sirens commit suicide because he learned how to negotiate it.
Well, it's like the Sphinx and Oedipus, right?
Exactly.
I answered the question, boom. But I was also, we didn't talk about one thing. The sirens are famous for their voices. And we didn't highlight that just now, but maybe that's maybe the, we talked about the siren streaming and we talked about the scream. We didn't talk about the voice.
Well, it's like, and also I will like not speak so much if someone else has something to say on this, but the dolphins, you know, I mean, the siren's voice is like, they're promising knowledge, but is anything they're saying representational? Like, or is this like dolphins singing? You know, I mean, it's a siren call is seductive, but what are they saying? Like, we don't, even in the Odyssey, it doesn't say what they're saying, you know.
Is there a connection to Siri?
Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
Siri
Alexa,
sirens.
Siri, Alexa. Mhm.
Thank you.
Siri. That's Siri and Siren. That's right. That's right. That's really
Very
good.
good. Very good.
Adele, if we, I'll quote you if you don't mind. Yes, that's really good. The Siri Siren. Thank you, everybody.
That was fascinating.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank
It
you.
Yeah, really great.
was
Thank you.
enjoyable to
We're gonna
talk. Thank you.
have closing remarks in a minute. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
Bye.